Imagine walking out to your patio in July and finding it overflowing with color, blooms spilling out of every pot, and not a single wilted leaf in sight, even though you forgot to water 3 days ago. Most gardeners assume that a container bursting with flowers has to be a container that gets babied every single day. But a small group of flowering shrubs quietly breaks that rule, blooming for months at a time, while shrugging off mist watering and blazing afternoon sun. Today we are counting down 7 container shrubs that combine months of blooms with genuinely low water needs. And the final shrub on this list might be the single most rewarding flowering plant you can grow in a pot. Stick around, because shrub number 1 is a showstopper that most beginners never think to try in a container. When most people picture container flowers, they picture annuals, petunias, marigolds, impatiens, the classic nursery flat planted in spring and pulled out in fall. Shrubs rarely make that shopping list, and that is a shame, because a well-chosen flowering shrub can outperform an annual in a pot. A shrub builds real structure over time. It comes back year after year, instead of dying with the first frost, and it needs far less replanting once it settles in. There is also a bigger shift happening in home gardening right now. More gardeners than ever are moving toward drought-tolerant plants, not because they do not love flowers, but because they are tired of watering pots twice a day just to keep them alive through a hot week. Water-wise gardening saves money, it saves time, and for anyone in a hot or dry climate, it can be the difference between a patio full of thriving plants and a patio full of crispy, disappointing pots. Drought-tolerant shrubs also tend to attract more pollinators, since many of them evolved in sunny, exposed conditions where bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds already do most of their foraging. Before we get into the list, it is worth being honest about something. No container plant truly needs zero water, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being straight with you. What these 7 shrubs actually offer is drought tolerance once they are established, along with the ability to bounce back gracefully if you miss a watering here and there, which is a very different and far more realistic promise. Container plants in general will always need more frequent watering than the same plant growing in the ground, simply because there is less soil to hold moisture, and pots heat up faster in the sun. These shrubs are the exception that makes container gardening genuinely low maintenance, not plants that defy the laws of horticulture. So here is a question worth sitting with as we go through this list. Which of these flowering shrubs would look best on your own patio, balcony, or front entrance? Keep that in mind, because by the end of this video, you may already know exactly which one is coming home with you. Also, if you enjoy practical gardening tips, beautiful low-maintenance plants, and creating high-impact container gardens, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We upload fresh gardening content every week to help you grow a healthier, more colorful, and more beautiful garden. Now, let's jump into the countdown, starting with shrub number 7. Shrub 7, Potentilla. We are starting the list with a shrub that many gardeners walk right past at the nursery because it looks so unassuming in a small pot, and that is Potentilla, also known as shrubby cinquefoil. Its botanical name is Potentilla fruticosa, and it is native to cool regions across North America, Europe, and Asia, which explains why it is one of the toughest, most cold-hardy flowering shrubs on this entire list. Potentilla thrives in USDA zones 2 through 7, making it an excellent choice for gardeners in colder climates who assumed drought-tolerant shrubs were only for the desert Southwest. In the ground, Potentilla typically reaches 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, and it keeps that same compact size in a container, so a pot 14 to 16 inches across, with good drainage holes, is plenty of room for it to thrive for several years. Here is the detail that earns Potentilla a spot on this list. It blooms from late spring all the way through the first frost in fall, which can mean 4, 5, or even 6 straight months of small, cheerful buttercup-shaped flowers in yellow, white, pink, or soft orange, depending on the variety you choose. Potentilla wants full sun for the best bloom production, though it will tolerate light afternoon shade in the hottest climates. It is not fussy about soil, doing well in average, well-draining potting mix, and it genuinely dislikes soggy roots, which is exactly why it holds up so well when watering gets inconsistent. Once established, usually after its first full growing season in the container, Potentilla can handle mist waterings far better than most flowering shrubs, thanks to a deep, fibrous root system that was built for exposed, dry hillsides in the wild. That same toughness is what makes it such a magnet for bees throughout its long bloom season, and it will occasionally draw butterflies as well, though it is not a major hummingbird plant. Pruning is refreshingly simple. A light trim in late winter or very early spring, removing about a third of the oldest stems, keeps the plant blooming vigorously and prevents it from getting woody and sparse in the center. Feed Potentilla lightly in spring with a balanced, slow-release fertilizer and resist the urge to overfeed, since too much nitrogen pushes leafy growth at the expense of flowers. In winter, Potentilla is remarkably cold-hardy, but container roots are more exposed to freezing temperatures than roots in the ground, so in zones 5 and colder, it helps to move the pot against a sheltered wall or wrap the container in burlap. Repot Potentilla every 2 to 3 years into a slightly larger container, refreshing the soil as you go. The most common beginner mistake is planting it somewhere it stays constantly wet, since poor drainage is the fastest way to lose this otherwise bulletproof shrub. The honest drawback here is that Potentilla flowers are small and subtle rather than dramatic, so if you want bold, oversized blooms, this may not be your showstopper. But for sheer reliability, cold hardiness, and months of steady color with minimal fuss, Potentilla is hard to beat, and it looks wonderful lining a sunny entryway or filling out the edge of a mixed container display. Shrub 6, Bluebeard. But this next shrub has a hidden advantage that most gardeners never expect from something so drought-tolerant, and that is a genuinely stunning, true blue flower color. Bluebeard, also called Caryopteris, carries the botanical name Caryopteris x clandinensis, a hybrid shrub with parentage tracing back to East Asia. It grows well in USDA zones 5 through 9, giving it a wide range across much of the country. Left in the ground, Bluebeard typically reaches 2 to 3 feet tall and slightly wider, and in a container, it stays even more compact, making an 18-inch pot with excellent drainage the ideal home for it. The bloom season for Bluebeard is late summer into fall, typically August through the first hard frost, right when many other flowering shrubs are winding down for the year. That timing alone makes it incredibly valuable, since it fills a color gap that most patios struggle with in late season, producing clusters of feathery blue, purple, or occasionally pink flowers along its silvery gray stems. Bluebeard needs full sun, at least 6 hours a day, to produce its best flower display, and it actually performs poorly in rich, heavily amended soil. A lean, fast-draining potting mix mimics the rocky, dry hillsides this shrub comes from. After its first year settling into the container, Bluebeard develops a woody, drought-adapted root structure that allows it to coast through hot, dry stretches that would stress out a typical flowering annual. That same late summer bloom period makes it one of the best bee magnets on this entire list, and butterflies are frequent visitors as well, though hummingbirds are only occasional guests. Pruning bluebeard is a once-a-year job, and it is important to get the timing right. Cut the entire plant back hard, down to about 6 to 8 inches, in early spring, since it blooms only on new growth produced that same year. Fertilize sparingly, since too much fertility leads to floppy stems and fewer flowers on this particular shrub. Winter care in containers matters here, because bluebeard is hardy in the ground down to zone 5, but a potted root ball can freeze more easily, so gardeners in colder zones should move the pot into an unheated garage or sheltered spot for winter. Repotting every 2 years into fresh, lean soil keeps bluebeard performing at its best, and the most common beginner mistake is planting it in rich garden soil or overwatering it, both of which lead to leggy growth and disappointing blooms. The honest drawback is that bluebeard looks fairly plain for most of the growing season before its late summer show, so it works best paired with an earlier blooming shrub for continuous color, making a beautiful combination near a front door or along a sunny balcony rail. Shrub 5, Dwarf Butterfly Bush. Most gardeners completely overlook this next one for containers, assuming it needs a huge garden bed, but dwarf butterfly bush varieties prove that assumption wrong. Butterfly bush has the botanical name Buttelasia davidii, and it is native to China, where it evolved on rocky, sun-scorched slopes, which explains much of its drought tolerance. Standard butterfly bush is hardy in USDA zones 5 through 9, and modern dwarf cultivars, often sold under names built for compact growth, are what make this shrub realistic for a pot. A full-sized butterfly bush can reach 6 to 10 feet, far too large for most containers, so seek out dwarf varieties that mature around 2 to 4 feet tall and wide in a container 16 to 20 inches across. This shrub earns its name honestly, and it also earns its spot on this list because of just how long it blooms. From early summer through the first frost, dwarf butterfly bush produces long, cone-shaped flower clusters in purple, pink, white, or deep magenta, often blooming for 4 months or longer without a break. Give it full sun and well-draining soil, since soggy roots are one of the fastest ways to lose this plant. Butterfly bush genuinely prefers to dry out somewhat between waterings, and established plants can tolerate short dry spells without dropping their blooms, a trait rooted in its native rocky hillside habitat. As the name promises, butterflies flock to this shrub in impressive numbers, and it is also a strong bee plant, though hummingbirds visit only occasionally, compared to true hummingbird favorites. If you want a patio that genuinely buzzes and flutters with life all summer, this is one of the most effective choices on the entire list. Pruning is important for keeping a container butterfly bush tidy and productive. Cut it back by about a third in early spring, and deadhead spent flower spikes throughout the season to encourage continuous reblooming rather than a single early flush. Feed lightly once in spring, since heavy fertilizing produces more leaves and fewer flowers. In winter, move containers to a sheltered spot in colder zones, since potted roots are more vulnerable to hard freezes than roots in the ground, and a thick layer of mulch on top of the soil adds extra insulation. Repot every 2 to 3 years, refreshing the soil to prevent compaction. The most common beginner mistake is skipping deadheading, which slows blooming by midsummer, and the honest drawback is that in a few regions butterfly bush can self-seed if spent flowers are left on, so choose a sterile or dwarf cultivar and deadhead regularly. Planted near a seeding area, a blooming butterfly bush turns an ordinary patio into a living pollinator garden. Shrub 4, Abelia. This plant proves that low maintenance does not mean boring, and it might be the most underrated shrub on this entire list. Glossy Abelia, botanically known as Abelia x grandiflora, is a hybrid shrub with origins tracing back to China, and it thrives in USDA zones 6 through 9. It typically grows 3 to 6 feet tall in the ground, but dwarf cultivars stay closer to 2 to 3 feet, which are the varieties to look for when growing it in a container. An 18 to 20-inch pot suits a dwarf abelia beautifully, giving its fine, arching branches room to cascade over the container's edge. What makes it truly special is the length of its bloom season, often flowering from late spring through fall, sometimes 5 months or more, of small, trumpet-shaped white or soft pink flowers. Many varieties also offer variegated or bronze-tinted foliage, so the container stays attractive even between bloom flushes. Abelia does best in full sun to partial shade, giving it more flexibility than some sun-hungry shrubs, which makes it a great option for balconies that only get morning light. It prefers well-draining, moderately fertile soil, and while it appreciates regular watering while getting established, mature abelia handles short dry periods with ease thanks to a dense, fibrous root system. That long, steady bloom period makes it a genuine bee magnet, and its tubular flowers are also visited by hummingbirds, while butterflies stop by less frequently than they do for butterfly bush. Pruning abelia is light touch work. A gentle shaping after the main flush of spring growth is usually enough, and removing a few of the oldest stems each year keeps the shrub full rather than leggy. Fertilize with a balanced, slow-release feed in early spring, and abelia generally needs winter protection only in the coldest parts of its hardiness range, where moving the container closer to the house or wrapping the pot helps protect the root zone. Repot every 2 to 3 years, and the most common beginner mistake is planting abelia in deep shade, which causes sparse blooming and stretched, weak growth. The honest drawback is that abelia's individual flowers are small and delicate rather than bold and dramatic, so it reads more as a graceful, romantic shrub than a bright focal point. Used as a softening element next to bolder blooms, or planted solo in a decorative urn by an entrance, abelia brings months of gentle color and constant pollinator activity with very little demand on your time. Shrub 3, Lavender. The next shrub on this list might be the most iconic drought-tolerant plant in the world, and for very good reason. It truly earns that reputation. English lavender, Lavandula angustifolia, is native to the Mediterranean, where it evolved on dry, rocky, sun-baked hillsides, and that heritage is written into how this plant grows. It is hardy in USDA zones 5 through 9, and it remains one of the most reliably drought-tolerant shrubs you can grow anywhere. Most lavender varieties reach 1 to 3 feet tall and wide, making them naturally well-suited to containers, and a 12 to 16-inch pot with excellent drainage is typically all a mature plant needs. Lavender blooms from late spring into midsummer, and with regular deadheading, many gardeners coax out a lighter second bloom in early fall, giving it a genuinely long season of purple, blue, pink, or white flower spikes depending on the variety. Full sun is non-negotiable for lavender, and it needs at least 6 to 8 hours of direct light to produce its signature fragrant blooms. Soil is where most container gardeners go wrong with this plant, since lavender demands fast, gritty drainage, and standard potting mix often needs to be amended with extra sand or perlite to prevent root rot. This is also where lavender's drought tolerance becomes almost legendary. Once established, it genuinely prefers to dry out completely between waterings, and overwatering is far more likely to kill a lavender plant than underwatering ever will be. Bees are drawn to lavender in extraordinary numbers, making it one of the best pollinator plants on this list, and butterflies visit regularly, while hummingbirds are only occasional visitors. Pruning lavender is essential rather than optional, and a light trim after the first bloom flush, along with a shaping cut in early spring, keeps the plant compact and prevents it from becoming woody at the base. Fertilizer should be used sparingly, if at all, since lavender actually performs best in lean soil, and excess feeding produces floppy growth with fewer flowers. Winter care depends heavily on your climate, since lavender dislikes both hard freezes and wet, humid winters. So in colder zones, move the container to a sheltered, dry spot, and in humid climates, make sure air circulates freely around the base of the plant. Repot every 2 to 3 years into fresh, gritty soil, and the most common beginner mistake by far is planting lavender in a rich, moisture-retentive potting mix, which slowly suffocates its roots. The honest drawback is that lavender genuinely struggles in humid climates regardless of how well it is watered, so gardeners in the hot, humid southeast may need to choose more heat-tolerant varieties or treat it as a shorter-lived plant. But where it thrives, few container shrubs deliver more fragrance, color, and pollinator traffic for so little effort. Shrub 2, Rosemary. The final shrub might be the perfect choice for beginners. But before we get there, here is a plant that quietly does double duty as both a flowering shrub and a kitchen herb. Rosemary, now classified botanically as Salvia rosmarinus, though many gardeners still know it as Rosmarinus officinalis, is native to the Mediterranean coastline, growing wild on sunny, salt-sprayed cliffs. Upright varieties are hardy in USDA zones 7 through 10, though in colder zones, gardeners often grow it as a container plant that comes indoors for winter, which suits it well since it was born to live in a pot. Rosemary typically reaches 2 to 4 feet tall in a container, staying more compact than it would in open ground, and a 14 to 18-inch pot with sharp drainage suits it well. Its bloom season often surprises people, since rosemary produces small, delicate blue, purple, pink, or white flowers along its stems, typically in late winter through spring, in mild climates, and it may rebloom sporadically throughout the year in the right conditions. Full sun is essential, and rosemary wants at least 6 hours of direct light to grow dense and flower reliably. Soil needs to be lean and extremely well draining, since this is a plant that evolved to thrive in poor, rocky ground, and rich, moisture-heavy potting mix is one of the fastest ways to lose it to root rot. Once established, rosemary is remarkably drought-tolerant, often going a week or more without water in mild weather without any sign of stress, since its woody stems and needle-like leaves conserve moisture. Bees are strongly attracted to its flowers, and butterflies visit occasionally, while hummingbirds are drawn to it less often than to more traditional hummingbird plants. Pruning rosemary regularly, which conveniently doubles as harvesting for the kitchen, keeps the plant bushy and prevents it from becoming woody and sparse in the middle. Avoid heavy fertilizing, since rosemary actually performs best when slightly underfed, and too much nitrogen weakens its fragrance and flavor along with its drought tolerance. Winter care depends on your zone. In zones 7 and warmer, rosemary can often stay outdoors year-round, while in colder regions, the container should be brought indoors to a bright, cool spot before the first hard frost. Repot every 2 to 3 years, sizing up gradually rather than jumping to a container that is too large, since rosemary actually dislikes having more soil than its roots can use. The most common beginner mistake is overwatering, especially in winter when growth slows down, and the honest drawback is that rosemary can eventually become quite woody and leggy after several years, requiring occasional hard pruning or replacement to keep it looking full. But for a plant that gives you flowers, fragrance, pollinator visits, and dinner, all from one pot, rosemary is one of the most genuinely useful shrubs you can grow. Shrub 1, Dwarf Crepe Myrtle. We have reached the final shrub on this list, and it might be the single most impressive low-maintenance flowering plant you can grow in a container. Crepe myrtle, botanically Lagerstroemia indica, is native to China and Korea, and gardeners across the hot, humid South have relied on it for generations as a nearly indestructible summer bloomer. It is hardy in USDA zones 7 through 9, sometimes 6 with winter protection, and dwarf cultivars bred for containers are what make this shrub realistic for a patio rather than a front yard tree. Standard crepe myrtles can grow into small trees 20 feet tall, but dwarf varieties stay in the 3 to 5 foot range, which is exactly the scale you want for a large container. A 20 to 24-inch pot with excellent drainage gives a dwarf crepe myrtle the root space it needs to put on a truly spectacular show. Here is why it earns the top spot on this list. Crepe myrtle blooms from early summer all the way through early fall, often producing ruffled, crepe paper-like flower clusters in vivid pink, red, purple, or white for a solid 12 to 16 weeks, longer than almost any other shrub on this countdown. Full sun is essential, and crepe myrtle needs at least 6 hours of direct light daily to produce its best flowering and to develop the attractive, peeling bark that many varieties are prized for, even after the blooms fade. It tolerates a wide range of soil types as long as drainage is good, and it is famously heat tolerant, actually performing best in the kind of scorching summer conditions that stress out many other flowering plants. Once its root system is established in the container, usually after the first full season, crepe myrtle handles mist waterings and dry spells with remarkable grace, a trait built from centuries of thriving in hot, humid, occasionally dry southern summers. Bees and butterflies both visit its flowers enthusiastically throughout the long bloom season, though it is not typically considered a major hummingbird plant. Pruning is simple and should happen in late winter while the plant is dormant, removing any crossing branches and shaping the framework. But avoid the aggressive stub-cutting style, sometimes seen on landscape crepe myrtles, since dwarf container varieties look and bloom best with a lighter touch. Fertilize with a balanced, slow-release feed in spring, and avoid excess nitrogen, which produces leafy growth at the expense of the flowers you are growing this shrub for in the first place. Winter care matters more in a container than in the ground, since potted roots freeze more easily, so in the cooler end of its hardiness range, move the pot against a sheltered wall or into an unheated garage for winter protection. Repot every 2 to 3 years into a slightly larger container, and the most common beginner mistake is choosing a full-sized variety instead of a true dwarf cultivar, which quickly becomes root-bound and stressed in a pot far too small for it. The honest drawback is that crepe myrtle drops its spent flowers steadily through the bloom season, which means a bit of light cleanup on the patio, and in humid climates, certain varieties can be prone to powdery mildew if airflow is poor, so choosing a modern, mildew-resistant cultivar is worth the extra research. Positioned as a centerpiece by an entrance or at the corner of a sunny patio, a blooming dwarf crepe myrtle in a large container genuinely stops neighbors in their tracks, and it is easy to see why this shrub takes the top spot on this list. So there you have it, 7 flowering shrubs that can transform an empty patio, balcony, or entrance into a space filled with months of color, all while asking for far less watering than the annuals most gardeners default to every spring. From the steady, cold, hardy blooms of potentilla through the late-season blue of bluebeard, the pollinator magnetism of butterfly bush and abelia, the Mediterranean toughness of lavender and rosemary, all the way to the show-stopping dwarf crepe myrtle, each of these shrubs solves the same frustrating problem in its own way. You get the patio full of flowers you have been picturing, without watering it every single day just to keep it alive. Remember that drought tolerance in every one of these plants develops after establishment, so give new container shrubs consistent water for that first season while their root systems settle in, and choose containers with real drainage holes and a fast-draining potting mix from the very start. Do that, and these shrubs will reward you with years of low-maintenance, high-impact blooms. If you had to choose just one from this list to start with, which container shrub would you pick for your own space? Drop it in the comments, since it genuinely helps shape what we cover next. Now that you know which shrubs can give you months of blooms with less maintenance, the natural next step is discovering the perennial flowers that can create that same low-water, long-blooming effect in your garden beds. So keep an eye out for that video next. Thanks for spending this time in the garden with me, and I will see you in the next one.